Welcome to the channel. Today we've got something incredible for you. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. A quiet village under a velvet night. A sealed invitation arrives at Miss Marple's door. Highmoor Grange, a mansion of stars and shadows. Tonight, riddles hide more than answers. A scream will pierce the stillness, a treasure will vanish, and every secret will be revealed under the starlight. Will you uncover the truth before the masks fall? Chapter 1. The Invitation Beneath the Stars. The evening was quiet in the village of St. Mary Mead, the kind of quiet that seemed to settle like a soft blanket over the cottages and gardens once the sun dipped below the horizon. In her small parlour, Miss Marple sat knitting by the lamplight, her spectacles catching the faint glow as the needles clicked rhythmically together. Outside, the last notes of birdsong faded, and the air was filled only with the gentle hum of crickets. It was in this unassuming stillness that the post arrived, an unusual time for it, long after the village postman's rounds. A young boy, panting slightly, handed her a sealed envelope stamped with a curious emblem, a silver star pressed into wax. Miss Marple, with her delicate fingers, turned it over once or twice before carefully breaking the seal. Inside lay a letter written in elegant script. Miss Marple, you are cordially invited to Highmoor Grange for an evening under the stars. Lady Winthrop requests your presence at her gathering of riddles, mysteries, and celestial wonders. Midnight shall be the hour. The stars are silent witnesses. Beneath the words was a line in smaller print, almost like a secret whispered onto the page. Not all puzzles are written in ink. Some are written in shadow. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She was no stranger to invitations, but this one bore a strange mixture of charm and foreboding. Highmoor Grange, an estate she had heard of but never visited, was known for its grand halls, its observatory, and perhaps more than anything else, the eccentricities of Lady Winthrop herself. Most women of Miss Marple's age might have dismissed the idea of travelling to a country estate for midnight riddles as a flight of fancy, but not she. Where others saw whimsy, Miss Marple often sensed design. The unusual hour, the peculiar seal, the cryptic note, these were not accidents, but threads of a tapestry yet unseen. She rose, placed the letter neatly on her side table, and peered out of the window. Above the village, the sky shimmered with countless stars, each twinkling like a watchful eye. There was something in their silent gleam that seemed almost expectant, as though the heavens themselves were waiting for her to follow this trail. The air in her room felt thicker than before, as though the letter had changed something unseen, tilting the evening ever so slightly toward mystery. She whispered softly to herself, the way she did when a puzzle first crossed her mind. Where shadows linger, truths are often waiting. And with that, Miss Marple knew she would go. Chapter 2. The Arrival at Highmoor Grange. The night of the gathering came swiftly, as nights so often do when one has much to think about. Miss Marple, dressed in a modest but well-kept coat, stepped into the waiting carriage arranged by Lady Winthrop herself. The driver, a silent man with a lantern swaying gently at the front, tipped his hat without a word. The wheels rolled over the winding country lanes, their rhythm steady and oddly lulling, like a clock marking the hour towards something unknown. The countryside outside was bathed in silver moonlight. Hedges and tall oaks cast long shadows, fields shimmered with the faint glow of dew, and above, the heavens glittered in a tapestry of stars. Miss Marple, sitting quietly, let her mind wander. Each star seemed almost to wink knowingly, as though aware of secrets yet to be revealed. After nearly an hour, the trees parted, and the great house of Highmoor Grange emerged. Its silhouette rose against the night like a dark sentinel, ivy clinging to its stone walls as though the house itself had been claimed by time. Candlelight glowed faintly in its many windows, warm and inviting, yet the sheer size of the mansion lent it a solemn, watchful air. As Miss Marple alighted, the crunch of gravel beneath her shoes was the only sound. The front doors, tall and carved with constellations, opened slowly as if on cue. A butler, severe in appearance, bowed his head and ushered her in. The entrance hall was magnificent, vaulted ceilings painted with celestial murals and a chandelier that glittered like a cluster of frozen stars. Tall clocks ticked softly in the corners, their pendulums swinging in unison, marking time with an almost ominous precision. Already gathered in the drawing room were the other guests. Miss Marple observed them with her quiet, unassuming glance. Professor Alderton, a stern man with spectacles glinting in the firelight, known for his lectures on astronomy. Mr. Fairfax, the novelist, tall and slightly flamboyant, with a habit of speaking in riddles even when none were asked. Miss Harrow, the governess, seated very still with downcast eyes, her hands folded so tightly they seemed almost to tremble. And at the far end, half in shadow, stood Henry Winthrop, Lady Winthrop's nephew, a young man with nervous energy flickering in his every movement. Then came Lady Winthrop herself. Draped in flowing silks of midnight blue, she carried an air of command softened only by the sparkle in her eyes. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, though behind that warmth was a sharp intelligence, one that seemed to measure each guest, as though they were not only visitors, but players in a game already begun. "I am most grateful you accepted my invitation," Lady Winthrop said, her voice calm yet resonant. "Tonight, beneath the stars, we shall share riddles of the mind, and perhaps discover truths we do not expect." The fire crackled softly. Shadows danced along the walls, and though the room was warm, Miss Marple could not shake the sense that a colder, more secretive current ran just beneath the surface of this gathering. As the guests exchanged polite words, laughter here and there, and sips of wine, Miss Marple simply observed. She knew that in such rooms, every glance, every hesitation, every too careful smile was as revealing as the riddles they had been invited to solve. And somewhere in this grand house, among its clocks, shadows, and starlit halls, she felt certain that a greater mystery waited, patient and silent. Chapter 3. The First Riddle by Candlelight. The evening deepened into night. The grandfather clocks in the great hall chimed softly, their tones echoing through the stone corridors of Highmoor Grange. Guests gathered in the drawing room, where the firelight painted their faces in shifting gold and shadow. The chatter dwindled to a hush as Lady Winthrop entered once more, her presence commanding without effort. In her hand, she held a slip of parchment, edges faintly yellowed as though touched by time. She raised it, and the flicker of the candles glimmered in her eyes. "My dear friends," she began, her voice smooth as velvet, "it is time for our first trial. Tonight, the stars watch us, and in their silent company, we will let riddles be our companions. Whoever can solve them will find not only answers, but perhaps discoveries of another kind." A slight murmur passed among the guests. Mr. Fairfax leaned forward eagerly, while Professor Alderton adjusted his spectacles with impatience. Miss Harrow, the governess, shrank further into her chair as though wishing to disappear altogether. Lady Winthrop cleared her throat and read aloud, "Where silence lingers, truth lies folded." The words seemed to float in the air, simple yet heavy, lingering like the soft toll of a bell. Immediately the professor declared, "The riddle is symbolic. It refers to the night sky, surely. Silence is the heavens, truth is in the stars. A poetic puzzle, nothing more." Mr. Fairfax chuckled and shook his head. "No, no, dear professor. Silence lingers in secrets, in hearts unspoken. Folded truth like letters unsent, his words dripped with theatrical flair, but Miss Marple noted the sparkle of calculation in his eyes. Miss Harrow whispered faintly, "Silence lingers, perhaps in prayer." Her hands clasped together as though to confirm her thought. But Miss Marple did not rush to speak. She rarely did. Instead, she let her gaze wander around the room, the tall shelves of books, the velvet drapes muffling sound, the faint draught seeping from the long hallway. Her eyes settled on the library door, half open, as if inviting quiet discovery. Where silence lingers, she thought, truth lies folded. And indeed, books were folded truths, silent, yet waiting to be read. Lady Winthrop smiled knowingly, her eyes brushing briefly toward Miss Marple, as though she too suspected the library was the answer. The guests soon dispersed, each determined to prove themselves, drifting into the long corridors of the mansion. Some hurried toward the gallery, some to the observatory, others toward the gardens. Their footsteps echoed, then softened, until the house was once more filled with that strange, weighty quiet. Miss Marple, calm as ever, rose from her seat and moved toward the library. The air grew cooler there, the only sound the faint rustle of paper as the curtains stirred. She trailed her fingers along the rows of spines, old and dusty, untouched for years. Somewhere here, she knew, a folded truth awaited, hidden perhaps in plain sight. The candles flickered lower, shadows lengthened across the leather-bound volumes, and in that hush of the library, the first whisper of mystery settled upon her. Chapter 4. A Shadow Among the Stars. The library's hush was thick, almost sacred, as Miss Marple's hand rested gently on the cracked spine of an old leather volume. The faint scent of dust and parchment hung in the air. She leaned closer, eyes glinting with quiet thought, when suddenly a scream shattered the silence. It was not the scream of surprise or merriment, but one sharp and raw, slicing through the stillness of Highmoor Grange like a blade. The sound seemed to tremble along the corridors, echoing from stone to wood, before fading into an uneasy hush. For a moment, the whole house seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple straightened, her calm expression unshaken, though her knitting fingers twitched ever so slightly at her side. She listened, tilting her head as if the very echoes might tell her more than the scream itself. It had come from the direction of the gardens, or more precisely, the small observatory that Lady Winthrop had so proudly mentioned earlier in the evening. Within moments, the guests hurried through the halls, their voices urgent. Mr. Fairfax, clutching his silk scarf, declared dramatically, "Something dreadful has happened," while Professor Alderton muttered darkly about hysteria. Lady Winthrop's face was stern yet pale, and together they all followed the sound of fear. The night air outside was cool and sharp, brushing against their cheeks as they approached the observatory. Its domed roof loomed above them, a dark silhouette against the glittering stars. The door stood ajar, swaying slightly on its hinges as though disturbed in haste. Inside, collapsed upon the cold stone floor, was Miss Harrow, the governess. Her face was drained of colour, her breath shallow, her trembling hand raised as if warding off some unseen figure. Lady Winthrop knelt beside her, urging calm. I saw him," Miss Harrow stammered between gasps. "A man, cloaked, moving among the shadows. He stood there, just beyond the telescope, watching me, and then he vanished into the night." The guests murmured uneasily, eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the observatory windows. Professor Alderton scoffed, though his own hands trembled faintly. "Nonsense, child." Imagination fueled by candlelight. But Miss Marple did not dismiss the claim. Quietly she stepped outside, her shoes pressing softly into the damp grass. The stars above were cold and bright, indifferent witnesses. She bent slightly, examining the ground illuminated by the lantern she carried. There, pressed into the dew-laden grass, were footprints, clear, deliberate, and leading not away toward the forest, as one might expect of an intruder fleeing the estate, but rather back toward the very house itself. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, though her face remained composed, almost serene. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Shadows may frighten the eye, but it is the direction of their steps that tells the truth." As the others fussed over the governess, fanning her and offering her sips of water, Miss Marple lingered by the footprints, letting the night's chill sink into her thoughts. Something, or someone, had indeed been here, and yet the stars above continued to shine in their eternal silence, as though keeping the secret a little while longer. Chapter 5. The puzzle deepens. The household did not return to its earlier ease after the scream in the observatory, though Lady Winthrop insisted on calm, and the governess, pale but conscious again, swore she needed no doctor. An unease clung to the walls of Highmoor Grange like ivy to stone. Later that evening the guests were summoned once more to the drawing-room. The fire burned lower now, its glow a little softer, its shadows a little longer. Lady Winthrop, poised as ever, lifted a second parchment from her sleeve. Her eyes flickered across the faces gathered around her, the professor still stiff with self-importance, the novelist smirking with theatrical delight, the governess withdrawn and fragile, and her nephew restless, fidgeting at every pause. "The next riddle," Lady Winthrop announced, her voice carrying like a note struck on crystal, "is this: what watches yet never speaks, what knows yet never sleeps." The words drifted into the hush of the room, where the only sound was the crackle of embers. Professor Alderton was the first to respond. "Surely this is the simplest of questions." "It is the heavens, of course. The stars watch eternally and never sleep." He folded his arms as though the matter were closed. But Mr. Fairfax leaned forward, a smile curling on his lips. "The stars, perhaps, or the moon. But could it not also be memory itself, always watching, never speaking, and forever awake within us?" His voice, lilting and dramatic, made the governess shiver. Miss Harrow, with her quiet voice, murmured, "Perhaps it is God." Her words carried the tremor of both faith and fear. Miss Marple, however, remained silent. Her eyes were not on the riddle's words, but on the objects around her. Slowly, she turned her gaze toward the far end of the corridor, where a tall grandfather clock stood sentinel, its pendulum swaying with soft inevitability. She rose without announcement, her steps light, her expression calm. The others followed her with curious eyes, their voices hushed but curious. Standing before the clock, Miss Marple touched its polished wood gently, as one might a living thing. "A clock," she said softly, almost to herself. "It watches. It marks every passing moment. It speaks not, yet never ceases its vigil. Awake, always awake." Her fingers traced the carvings along its side. Then, leaning closer, she noticed something, a small seam, not quite aligned, near the panel of its base. With practiced gentleness, she pressed it, and the panel gave way with a quiet click. Inside was a small, hidden compartment, empty. But the faint traces of dust disturbed told her it had not been empty long. Lady Winthrop's eyes sharpened, though she said nothing. The professor muttered in disbelief, while Fairfax clapped his hands softly in admiration. Miss Marple stepped back, her voice calm as the ticking that filled the hall. "A riddle is only a key. What matters is the door it opens. Someone has used this clock. Recently the pendulum swayed steady and inexorable. Tick, tock, tick, tock. and with every sound Miss Marple felt that the puzzle was no longer a game of riddles, but a pattern of intentions, subtle, secret, and dangerous, woven into the very heart of Highmoor Grange. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Heirloom. The hour had grown late, yet the riddles pressed on. Lady Winthrop led her guests into the long gallery, where portraits of ancestors watched with painted eyes from their gilded frames. At the far end of the hall, enclosed in a glass case set upon a velvet stand, lay the object of whispered fascination, the Winthrop star map. It was no ordinary map. Crafted centuries ago, its parchment bore constellations drawn in shimmering silver ink, each star carefully marked as though the heavens themselves had lent their light to the page. Legends claimed it guided travellers, explorers, and even fortune-seekers. Lady Winthrop had announced earlier that it would serve as the prize for those who solved her riddles. But to Miss Marple's mind, such treasures rarely served only as prizes. The guests gathered, the flames from tall candelabra casting golden pools upon the floor. The professor leaned close to the glass, spectacles glinting. Mr. Fairfax gestured with dramatic reverence, spinning some tale of ancient stargazers. The governess stood back, her hands clasped tightly, as though afraid even to look too long. Lady Winthrop herself stood proudly by the case, her voice soft but firm. This map has remained in my family for generations. Tonight it also serves as our measure of trust. Let us see who among us can find the wisdom to claim it. But scarcely had she spoken than a sudden draught flickered the flames. The lights wavered, shadows stretched, and in that moment's distraction came the sharp crack of breaking glass. Gasps filled the gallery. Lady Winthrop's hand flew to her throat. The case, once pristine, stood open, shards glimmering like ice on the floor. The velvet stand lay bare. The star map was gone. For a breath, no one moved. The silence was so heavy it seemed the portraits themselves held their breath. Then voices erupted all at once, accusations sharp and wild. "It must have been her," cried Mr. Fairfax, pointing dramatically at the governess. "She was nearest the case." "Nonsense," barked the professor, his face flushed. "She is too timid. If anyone had motive, it is you, sir, with your endless tales of treasure and fame." The governess, pale and trembling, protested faintly. I did not. I could not." Henry Winthrop, the nephew, shifted uneasily, his gaze darting toward the door as though measuring escape. His voice cracked as he muttered, "This is absurd. Anyone could have done it." Miss Marple, meanwhile, did not join the chorus. Instead, her eyes wandered quietly across the gallery. She noticed the candles again, how one had burned lower than the rest, wax pooling unevenly, as though it had been lit far earlier in the evening. A small thing, but in such moments, small things often speak the loudest. She bent carefully to the floor. Among the glitter of broken glass, she saw not just shards but a single thread, dark, fine, caught upon the jagged edge. She brushed it gently into her hand, folding it away before anyone could notice. Straightening, she let her gaze drift upward. The chandelier above still swayed faintly from the draught, its crystals catching starlight through the tall windows. The house itself seemed to shiver at the theft. Calmly, Miss Marple murmured, "Theft done in darkness leaves a trail in the light. One only needs to look closely." Her words barely rose above the rising arguments, yet Lady Winthrop's sharp eyes caught hers, and in that brief, silent exchange, both women understood. The game had changed. The riddles were no longer just diversions. The true puzzle had begun. Chapter 7. Whispers in the gallery. The gallery remained restless long after the star map's disappearance. The guests were ushered into the smaller music room for wine and reassurances. but the uneasy murmur of suspicion clung to them like the faint smoke of the extinguished candles. Lady Winthrop, ever composed, insisted that the matter would be addressed with calm logic come morning. Yet her eyes were sharper now, her voice edged with unspoken weight. Miss Marple, claiming weariness, excused herself early and drifted back into the gallery. She moved quietly, as she always did, her presence so light that even the old floorboards barely creaked beneath her step. The portraits, caught in candle glow, seemed to lean closer, as though the painted ancestors themselves wished to listen. It was then she heard them, soft voices, hushed and hurried, at the far end of the gallery. She stilled, her small figure hidden partly behind a tall marble pillar. The voices belonged to Henry Winthrop and Lady Winthrop herself. "Please, Aunt." Henry's voice carried the desperate tremor of a man at the edge of something dangerous. "I only need enough to settle the debts. You don't understand what it's like. They won't wait much longer." Lady Winthrop's reply was measured, calm but heavy with iron. "I understand more than you think, Henry. And I understand this. The map is not yours to barter with. It belongs to this house, this family, this legacy. To lose it would be to lose our name." There was a pause, Henry pacing, his shoes tapping against the polished floor. "But surely," he pressed, his voice cracking, "surely you don't mean to give it away as some trinket for riddles? That map is worth more than gold. It could free me. It could free all of us." Lady Winthrop's tone grew colder, though sorrow threaded beneath it. "Freedom bought by betrayal is no freedom at all. Do not speak of this again, Henry. I beg you." The young man muttered something low, almost inaudible. But Miss Marple caught the brittle edge of frustration, of a will pressed hard against the wall of necessity. The silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves. At last, footsteps retreated, and the two parted ways. Lady Winthrop moving toward her chambers, Henry disappearing into the shadows of the eastern corridor. Miss Marple remained in her quiet nook, her expression calm but thoughtful. She had not twitched, nor gasped, nor frowned. Only her eyes, soft yet unyielding, reflected the weight of what she had just heard. "Debts," she whispered inwardly. "Desperation is a powerful motive, yet desperation does not always make a thief. It makes a mask, and masks in time will fall." She turned her gaze to the shattered glass case, still glimmering faintly in the gallery's candlelight. The star map was missing, yes, but the true puzzle was not merely who had taken it. The true puzzle was why each guest needed it so desperately. The house was still. The stars beyond the windows glittered with their eternal patience. And Miss Marple, with her soft, almost grandmotherly calm, continued to watch and wait. For in silence, truths always whispered, if one had the ear to hear them. Chapter 8. The Starry Clue. The house had fallen into uneasy slumber. Most of the guests had retired to their rooms, though Miss Marple suspected sleep would not come easily to many under Highmoor Grange's roof that night. The theft of the star map had turned a night of riddles into a night of suspicion, and suspicion has a way of echoing louder than footsteps in empty halls. Miss Marple, however, did not rest. Instead, she wandered softly toward the observatory. The corridor was long and lined with windows, and through each one the stars gazed down, cold, eternal, watchful. The silence of the house seemed deeper here, the kind of silence that holds its breath, waiting. The observatory's door creaked faintly as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was tinged with the faint scent of oil and dust, and the great telescope stood like a sentinel, its brass fittings catching the faintest glimmer of moonlight. She approached it quietly, her hand brushing the cool metal of its frame. Earlier that evening, The governess had sworn she saw a cloaked figure standing here, and though others dismissed it as nerves or fancy, Miss Marple had never dismissed the words of those overlooked. Leaning closer, she noticed something subtle. The telescope's lens was smudged, as though someone had handled it in haste. Curious, she adjusted the angle and peered inside. At first, she expected only the glitter of constellations, but instead, she saw a faint, unnatural shadow lodged just at the rim. She withdrew the lens cap carefully, and there, wedged inside, was a small scrap of parchment. Her fingers, delicate yet steady, unfolded it. The writing was hurried, scrawled as if done in secrecy. When stars fall, so too shall masks. The words, cryptic yet heavy, made her pause. The riddles of Lady Winthrop had been clever diversions, yet this fragment did not feel like part of a parlour game. No, this was sharper, more deliberate, a warning, or perhaps a truth someone meant her to find. Miss Marple tucked the fragment neatly into her sleeve. Then she lifted her gaze through the telescope once more, this time aligning it toward the heavens. The great expanse stretched out before her, pinpricked with light, vast and eternal. Yet even as she admired its beauty, her mind ticked quietly through the facts. A candle burned shorter than the rest, a hidden compartment in the clock disturbed, a thread caught on broken glass, and now, this riddle fragment, hidden where only the observant might discover it. She exhaled softly, her breath barely stirring the cool air. "The stars may be silent," she murmured, "but they shine upon every secret all the same." Behind her, the house remained silent. But Miss Marple knew the silence was only surface. Beneath it, secrets moved like shadows, restless, waiting, soon to be unmasked. Chapter 9. The unmasking beneath the moon. The moon had climbed high, pouring its pale light across the lawns of Highmoor Grange. Within the house, candles burned low, their flames quivering in the draughts that whispered along the corridors. The guests, restless and uneasy, had gathered once more in the drawing-room at Lady Winthrop's request. There was a tension in the air, a silent heaviness. The professor paced, muttering to himself. The governess sat nervously, twisting her hands. Mr. Fairfax lounged in his chair, though his eyes were sharp, waiting for drama, and Henry Winthrop, pale and agitated, could barely sit still, his gaze darting often toward the doors. At the far end of the room stood Lady Winthrop, regal in her midnight blue gown, her expression as calm and commanding as ever. And beside the hearth, seated as though she belonged to the very room itself, was Miss Marple. She did not raise her voice, nor did she adopt any grand gesture. Instead, she spoke softly, her words flowing into the hush like the gentle stream of water into still air. "My dear friends, this evening has been filled with riddles, riddles of words and riddles of actions. We sought answers among parchment and stars, yet the truest riddles are always written in what people do when they think no one sees." The guests leaned closer, some with skepticism, others with growing unease. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Consider, if you will, the footprints in the dew outside the observatory. They did not lead away into the night as one might expect of a prowler, but back into this very house. Whoever frightened Miss Harrow wished us to believe in an intruder, but in truth, the shadow she saw was cast by one among us." The governess gasped softly, her face paling. The professor frowned, though unease flickered across his features. "Then," Miss Marple continued gently, "there is the matter of the second riddle. What watches yet never speaks. We found the answer in the clock, yes, but also a hidden compartment within it. It had been disturbed recently, used to conceal or transfer something." Her gaze moved, calm but unyielding, toward Henry Winthrop. He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tightening around the arm of his chair. "And in the gallery," she went on, "a candle burned shorter than the rest, lit hours before the gathering began. Someone needed light earlier than the others, to prepare, to plan. The room grew quieter still. The only sound was the faint ticking of a distant clock, steady as a heartbeat. And finally, Miss Marple said, her tone soft as silk but edged with truth, the fragment found within the telescope. When stars fall, so too shall masks, a clue hidden not as part of the game but as a warning. For indeed masks always fall. Her eyes, bright and kind, rested fully now on Henry. You, my dear young man, feared your debts more than disgrace. You planned to take the star map and sell it. You staged the broken glass, the scream of shadows, the false intruder. But the stars themselves betrayed you. Your hurried hand upon the telescope, your thread left caught on the case, your trail leading inward instead of out. For a moment, Henry said nothing. His face drained of colour, his lips parted as though to protest, but no words came. The silence pressed on him, heavy, suffocating. At last he buried his face in his hands, a trembling confession spilling forth. "Yes, it's true," he whispered hoarsely. I thought it would save me. I never meant for harm. Only to be free." Lady Winthrop closed her eyes briefly, sorrow etched upon her features. But she did not speak. The truth had been laid bare, and her silence was heavier than any words. Miss Marple, still seated, only nodded once. Her voice was soft, almost tender. "Desperation makes poor company, Henry. But truth, once found, brings its own kind of mercy." The fire crackled softly. The guests sat hushed, subdued, as though the very house itself exhaled after holding its breath. Above them, the moonlight spilled through the tall windows, calm and eternal, as masks indeed fell away, and truth, folded in silence, was finally revealed. Chapter 10. Solace among the starlit riddles. The night had unravelled its secrets, and with them, its shadows. Henry's trembling confession had settled the air into a silence heavier than anger, softer than pity. Lady Winthrop, tall and dignified, had asked no more questions. Her eyes alone spoke volumes of sorrow and of resignation. The guests, subdued, had retreated to their chambers, each carrying with them a memory of the night that would linger like a faint echo long after the candles burned away. But Miss Marple, as ever, did not hurry to rest. Instead, she wandered out into the garden, her steps slow and measured across the dew-kissed grass. The hour was close to dawn. The stars still glittered overhead, though fainter now, as the horizon began to pale with the first brush of morning. The air was cool, almost tender, and each breath seemed to wash the house's tension from her shoulders. She paused near the rose arbour, resting her hands lightly on the wooden railing. Above her, the heavens stretched vast and quiet, eternal watchers to human folly. How strange, she thought, that men chase stars on parchment while forgetting to see them shining freely above. The events of the night drifted through her mind like pages in a book. A scream in the observatory, footprints turned inward, a hidden compartment in the clock, a candle burned too soon. And at the heart of it all, not malice but desperation, the age-old human riddle of need and choice, written not in ink but in action. She thought of Henry, young, foolish, drowning in debts of his own making. His crime had been clumsy, but born of panic rather than cruelty. For such souls, Miss Marple often held the quietest compassion. She knew well enough that truth, once revealed, was both punishment and release. Behind her, the great house loomed, silent now, its windows dark save for one faint glow in Lady Winthrop's chamber. That glow, Miss Marple mused, was not for the star map, but for the far heavier weight of family, of duty and of disappointment. The eastern sky grew brighter, brushing the fields in pale gold. The stars, one by one, faded into the soft blue. Miss Marple lifted her eyes, watching their quiet retreat, and whispered to herself, as though the heavens might hear, "Riddles are not always games. They are lessons in patience, in listening, in seeing what others do not. And the greatest riddle of all, perhaps, is the human heart." A blackbird sang, sweet and clear, announcing the day. Miss Marple turned, her small figure almost blending with the garden's quiet charm. She would return to St. Mary Mead, to her knitting and her teacups, to the comfort of ordinary village life. Yet she carried with her the solace of the Starlit Riddles, a reminder that beneath silence, truth always waits to be unfolded. And so, the dawn rose gently upon Highmoor Grange, and the mystery, like the stars, slipped peacefully into memory.